In the 13th year of the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, when the Nile's inundation had blessed the black land with abundance, and the granaries overflowed with wheat that gleamed like copper in the sun, there lived in the bustling port city of Thebes a merchant woman named Nefertari, daughter of Khenti, who had inherited her father's trading enterprise upon his unexpected death from a scorpion's sting during a routine expedition to the turquoise mines of Serabit el-Qadim. And though the priests and nobles whispered that no woman should command such ventures into the treacherous wilderness, where Seth's breath scorched the very stones and bandits lurked behind every wind-carved ridge, Nefertari possessed a spirit as unyielding as the granite obelisks that pierce the sky before Ra's temples, for she had accompanied her father on 7 previous journeys and knew the desert paths as intimately as a scribe knows his papyrus. Understanding which wadis held secret water sources even in the driest seasons, which rock formations provided shelter from the killing winds that could strip flesh from bone, and which Bedouin tribes could be trusted for safe passage through their ancestral territories in exchange for fine linen, bronze implements, and the precious Egyptian beer that they craved above all other luxuries. Her decision to lead the summer caravan to the Red Sea ports where frankincense from Punt, myrrh from the land of God, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, and exotic spices from lands so far east that their names were barely whispers, in the marketplaces would arrive on merchant vessels captained by dark-skinned traders who spoke in melodious tongues that sounded like water flowing over. River stones had caused an uproar among the male merchants of Thebes, who gathered each morning in the shadows of Karnak's towering pylons to negotiate contracts, exchange gossip, and plot their commercial strategies with the cunning of jackals circling a wounded gazelle. They argued that the journey across the eastern desert was no mere trading expedition, but a test of endurance that would break even the strongest men, for the route stretched across countless leagues of scorching sand and jagged mountains, where temperatures during the day could make blood boil in a man's veins, while nights brought cold so intense that water froze solid in leather. Skins, where venomous serpents coiled beneath seemingly innocent rocks, where lions occasionally wandered from their usual hunting grounds to prey upon unwary travelers, and where the greatest danger of all lurked in the form of the Medjay bandits and renegade Nubian raiders who had rejected the pharaoh's authority and established themselves as lords of the wasteland, attacking caravans with swift brutality, slaughtering the men, taking the women as slaves, and vanishing into the maze of canyons and valleys that only they knew how to navigate. But Nefertari stood before the merchant council in the great hall of her father's house, a structure of mud brick and cedar wood that had been whitewashed until it gleamed like the moon, its walls decorated with painted scenes of successful trading expeditions, showing camels laden with goods, ships with billowing sails, and her father presenting tribute to the pharaoh himself. And she spoke with a voice that carried the authority of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice, reminding them that her father Khenti had trusted her judgment implicitly, that she had negotiated the most profitable contracts of the previous 3 seasons, that she knew the desert signs that foretold sandstorms hours before they struck, that she could read the stars as clearly as any navigator who sailed the Great Green Sea, and most importantly, that she had already secured agreements with 12 other merchant houses who would contribute goods, animals, and men to the caravan in exchange for shares in the profits, creating an enterprise so large that its success would bring wealth to many families and honor to Thebes itself. Among those who had pledged support was a Menken, an older merchant whose own sons had died of fever during a disastrous expedition to the gold mines of Nubia, leaving him without heirs and hungry for one final great success before he journeyed to the west to stand before Osiris in judgment. And though he harbored deep reservations about following a woman's leadership, his practical nature recognized that Nefertari's planning was meticulous and her knowledge genuine. So he contributed 20 donkeys, 3 trusted servants, and his own presence as an advisor, though he made clear to anyone who would listen that he would watch her every decision with the scrutiny of a hawk eyeing a field mouse. There was also Jehudi, a young scribe barely past his 20th year who had recently completed his training in the House of Life and sought adventure beyond the endless copying of tax records and religious texts that constituted most scribal work. and he volunteered to serve as the caravan's record keeper, documenting all transactions, maintaining inventories, and writing letters that could be sent back to Thebes with any travelers they might encounter heading west. For communication with the city was essential to ensure that families knew their men lived and that business partners could prepare for the caravan's eventual return. The most unexpected supporter was Baketaman, a priestess of Hathor whose temple duties included blessing travelers and whose brother had married Nefertari's younger sister, creating a family bond that transcended the usual boundaries between the sacred and commercial spheres. And she provided not just her blessings, but also 3 amulets that had been consecrated in secret rituals before the goddess's golden statue. Amulets shaped like the Eye of Horus that would protect against evil spirits, accidents, and the malevolent magic that desert sorcerers were rumored to wield against those who ventured into their domains. As the season of Shomu approached, when the floodwaters had fully receded and the fields lay cracked and dry under the merciless sun, making travel through the agricultural lands easier but intensifying the already brutal heat that would plague the desert crossing, Nefertari assembled her caravan in the vast courtyard outside Thebes's eastern gate, where merchants, laborers, priests, seeking healing minerals from desert mountains, and curious citizens gathered to witness the spectacle. For caravans were always events that stirred the imagination, representing as they did the thin thread connecting civilized Egypt with the vast unknown world beyond its borders. The caravan consisted of 47 donkeys and 15 camels. Those strange beasts from the north that could survive for days without water and carried loads that would break a donkey's back. Though their temperamental nature and tendency to spit foul-smelling cud at anyone who displeased them made them unpopular with the handlers. 32 men, including merchants, servants, guards, and laborers, each selected for specific skills, whether it be expertise in animal handling, proficiency with weapons, knowledge of navigation, or simply the brute strength needed to dig out animals trapped in sand or move the heavy bundles of trade goods that would be exchanged at the Red Sea ports. The goods themselves represented the finest products of Egyptian civilization, carefully chosen to appeal to foreign traders who had traveled unimaginable distances to reach these meeting points where cultures collided in passionate bargai. Ning sessions that might last for days. There were bolts of linen so finely woven that they were nearly transparent, their whiteness achieved through repeated washing and beating that only Egypt's skilled textile workers could accomplish. There were bronze tools and weapons forged by master craftsmen who knew secret techniques for creating edges that held their sharpness through years of use. There were ceramic vessels of elegant design, decorated with geometric patterns and scenes from daily life, their glazes ranging from deep blue to vibrant green. There were carefully sealed jars of honey from the Delta's most productive hives, honey so pure and sweet that it was valued as both food and medicine. There were blocks of natron salt, essential for mummification, and highly prized by foreign nobles who had adopted Egyptian burial customs. There were cosmetics, including kohl for eye paint made from ground galena and malachite. And most precious of all, there were small quantities of gold dust and electrum from the desert mines, metals that gleamed with the light of Ra himself and drove men to madness with desire. The departure ceremony was conducted by priests who chanted prayers to ensure divine protection, sprinkling holy water from the Nile upon the lead animals and marking Nefertari's forehead with ochre mixed with sacred oil, while musicians played drums and sistrums, creating rhythms that were meant to ward off the demons of the desert, those invisible entities that delighted in causing travelers to lose their way, to see mirages of water where none existed, to hear voices calling them toward death in the empty wastes, and as the sun climbed toward its zenith, painting the eastern sky with harsh white light that promised the inferno to come, Nefertari gave the signal, and the caravan lurched into motion with the groaning of camels, the braying of donkeys, the shouting of handlers, and the collective prayers of those who remained behind, watching until the long line of animals and men became mere shadows wavering in the heat distortion, then vanishing entirely as if swallowed by the desert itself. The first 3 days passed without incident as they followed the well-traveled route along the edge of the cultivation, where green fields gradually gave way to brown scrubland, then to bare rock and sand. The transition from the black land to the red land being so distinct, it seemed as if a line had been drawn by the gods to separate life from death, abundance from scarcity, the domain of Osiris from the realm of Seth. And during these relatively easy days, Nefertari established the routines that would govern their journey, rising before dawn when the eastern sky showed only the faintest purple promise of coming light, conducting a quick inspection of the animals to check for injuries or illness that might have developed overnight, organizing the loading of supplies with meticulous care to ensure balanced weights that would not cause sores on the animals' backs, setting the order of march with the most experienced guides at the front and reliable guards at the rear, while she herself moved up and down the line throughout the day, checking on everything, and finally selecting appropriate camping sites before the sun's descent, where there might be some small shelter from rocks or hills, and where the handlers could create temporary corrals for the animals using ropes and stakes. Water discipline was established from the very beginning, for though they carried an adequate supply in sealed pottery vessels and leather skins, the desert's capacity to drain moisture from living bodies was extraordinary, and Nefertari knew that many expeditions had ended in catastrophe because men drank too freely in the early stages, assuming they could refill their vessels at the next well, only to discover that it had dried up or been poisoned by enemies. So she instituted strict rationing with specific quantities distributed at dawn, midday, and evening, the amounts carefully calculated based on the exertion level expected for each day's journey. And though some men grumbled, particularly those who had never experienced true desert thirst, Amenken supported her policy vocally, describing in graphic detail an expedition 20 years earlier where he had watched men go mad from dehydration, fighting over the last drops of water like rabid dogs, before dying with their tongues swollen black and their eyes sunken into their skulls. On the fourth day, they encountered their first ominous sign when scouts reported finding the remains of a small caravan about 3 hours' march to the north, just scattered bones and scraps of cloth being slowly buried by the drifting sand. The skulls showing the distinctive fractures that came from heavy weapons rather than the clean deaths that might result from natural causes like dehydration or snakebite. And this discovery created ripples of unease throughout the group because it confirmed what everyone knew but preferred not to discuss openly, that the desert was home to predators of the human variety who saw other travelers not as fellow souls deserving assistance, but as opportunities for plunder. Nefertari ordered the guards to increase their vigilance, establishing a rotating watch schedule that would maintain constant surveillance even during the brief rest periods, and she redistributed some of the weapons, ensuring that even the servants and laborers who were not trained fighters had at least a knife or wooden club with which they might defend themselves if attacked, for she understood that in the chaos of a bandit raid, survival often depended on appearing strong enough that the attackers would seek easier prey elsewhere, bandits being practical creatures who preferred victims that would not fight back, that would simply surrender their goods and lives without inflicting casualties that might weaken the raiding party. The tension increased on the fifth day when they left behind the last known landmarks and entered a region of broken terrain where jagged black mountains erupted from the desert floor like the teeth of some buried monster, their peaks sharp enough to tear cloth and skin, their shadows providing welcome but brief respite from the hammer-blow heat of midday. And navigation became more challenging because the paths wound between these formations in ways that seemed random but actually followed ancient routes established centuries ago by the first traders who had braved this crossing, routes marked by subtle signs like particular rock cairns, scratches on stone faces that could only be seen from certain angles, or the dried bones of animals placed in specific patterns. And Nefertari had to rely on both her memory of her father's teachings and the knowledge of their chief guide, a grizzled Bedouin named Kabash who had been leading caravans for 30 years and whose leathery face seemed to be made of the same material as the desert rocks themselves, creased and weathered until it was impossible to guess his true age. Kabash regarded Nefertari with the same skeptical tolerance he might show to a child who insisted on playing at adult tasks, never directly contradicting her orders, but making his doubt clear through subtle gestures. The way he would pause before implementing her decisions, as if giving her a chance to reconsider. The way his eyes would flick toward Amenken, as if seeking confirmation from a male authority before proceeding. And this pattern of quiet resistance, began to erode her authority among the men who naturally looked to such an experienced guide for leadership, creating a dangerous division in the caravan's command structure that could prove fatal if a crisis required immediate, unified action. The crisis came on the seventh day when they were traversing a particularly narrow wadi with steep walls on both sides that rose 50 feet high, creating a natural corridor that funneled the caravan into a tight formation, making them vulnerable to attack from above. And Nefertari had felt uneasy about this route from the moment Kabash proposed it, suggesting instead a longer but more open path that would cost them an additional day but would not expose them to such obvious danger. Yet Kabash had argued forcefully that the longer route would consume water reserves they might need later, that this wadi was used frequently by traders and had never been the site of an ambush in his experience. And critically, he had turned to Amenken while making these arguments, appealing to male solidarity and practical wisdom against what he clearly considered female overcaution. Amenken had sided with the guide, swayed by the water conservation argument and perhaps unconsciously influenced by the cultural assumption that men naturally understood matters of route planning and security better than women, and Nefertari had been forced to concede rather than create an open confrontation that would shatter the chain of command entirely. But she had insisted on sending scouts ahead to check for danger and on spreading the caravan out as much as the narrow wadi allowed, so that if an attack came, it would not catch everyone in a single trap. The scouts returned with a report that the wadi was clear, and the caravan began its passage through the shadowed corridor where the temperature dropped not, iceably, a blessing that the men welcomed after hours under the direct sun. And they were perhaps 2/3 through the passage, beginning to relax as the far opening came into view. When the first rocks came tumbling down from the heights, small stones initially that might have been dismissed as natural rockfall, except that they were followed immediately by larger projectiles, clearly thrown by human hands. And then the bandits appeared along the ridge tops, dark silhouettes against the bright sky, perhaps 20 men armed with bows, spears, and the distinctive curved swords favored by the Nubian tribes, and their leader, a massive man wearing a leopard skin over his shoulders, called down in accented but understandable Egyptian, demanding that the caravan stop, surrender all valuable goods, and the men would be allowed to leave with their lives, though the animals and women would be kept. The discipline that Nefertari had drilled into her guards proved its value in that moment, as instead of panicking, they responded exactly as she had instructed during countless evening practice sessions that many had considered a waste of time, forming a defensive perimeter around the animals and creating shield walls using the large leather traveling screens that could serve double duty as protection against both sun and weapons, while the servants and laborers rushed to calm the animals, who were braying and groaning in terror, their panic potentially as dangerous as the bandits themselves, since a stampede in the narrow wadi could trample people and scatter the cargo, making it easy pickings for the raiders. Nefertari did not hesitate, did not look to Amenken or Kabash for approval or guidance, but raised her voice with a command that cut through the chaos, ordering 3 of her best archers to target the bandit leader, while the rest maintained covering fire to keep the raiders pinned on the heights. And simultaneously, she directed the caravan to continue moving forward because remaining stationary made them easier targets, and the only hope lay in reaching the open desert beyond the wadi, where they would have room to maneuver, and the bandits' advantage of high ground would be neutralized. The archers, 2 brothers named Sobek and Kenti, who had learned their skills hunting crocodiles and waterfowl in the delta marshes, and a Nubian mercenary called Nakti, whose accuracy was legendary, drew their composite bows and sent arrows singing upward, the shafts arcing through the bright air with lethal purpose. And whether by exceptional skill or the blessing of the gods, one arrow found its target, striking the bandit leader in the shoulder and causing him to stagger backward with a cry of pain and rage that echoed off the wadi walls. And this small victory galvanized the defenders, while creating uncertainty among the raiders who had expected easy prey, and instead found organized resistance. The caravan surged forward, not in panicked flight, but in controlled retreat, the guards maintaining their protective formation, while handlers drove the animals as quickly as possible toward the wadi's end. And the bandits' arrows rained down, causing several casualties. A donkey fell, screaming whis, to an arrow through its neck. its thrashing legs, dangerous, until Nocti ended its suffering with a quick knife thrust. One of the younger guards took an arrow in his thigh and had to be dragged along by his companions, his blood leaving a dark trail in the sand. And Jehudi, the scribe, received a deep gash across his forearm from a stone that struck with enough force to crack bone. Yet the caravan kept moving, driven by Nefertari's voice calling encouragement, direction, commands, her presence seeming to be everywhere at once. And when they finally burst out of the wadi into the open desert, the bandits did not pursue, perhaps because their leader's injury had dampened their enthusiasm, perhaps because the caravan had proven more troublesome than anticipated, or perhaps because a force of mounted men appeared on the horizon at that precise moment, travelers who might have been more bandits, or might have been legitimate traders whose presence complicated the tactical situation. As the adrenaline of battle faded, replaced by the shaking aftermath of violence and the pain of wounds, Nefertari ordered camp to be made despite the sun still being high, recognizing that the men and animals needed time to recover from the trauma, and she personally supervised the treatment of the injured, drawing on the medical knowledge her mother had taught her, cleaning wounds with beer and honey to prevent the evil spirits that caused festering, applying poultices of herbs that had been packed specifically for such emergencies, and speaking calmly to each wounded man, praising his courage and promising that his sacrifice would be remembered and rewarded. The young guard with the arrow wound was in the worst condition, the bronze point having penetrated deep into muscle and possibly nicked the bone, and extraction would be agonizing. But Nefertari prepared a draught of opium mixed with wine, a precious substance that she had brought for exactly such emergencies, and once the man had drunk deeply, and his eyes had taken on the glassy quality that indicated the drug's effect, she used a bronze knife heated in the fire to cut away the flesh around the arrow shaft. Then gripped the shaft firmly and pulled with steady pressure, while two strong men held the patient down, and the arrow came free with a wet sucking sound, its barbed head dark with blood, and she quickly packed the wound with linen soaked in honey and bound it tightly, knowing that the real danger now was not the injury itself, but the possibility of infection that could turn flesh black and fill the blood with poison. That evening, as the men gathered around small fires, cooking flatbread and roasting strips of dried meat, the mood was somber but also contained an element of pride, for they had faced danger and prevailed, had demonstrated courage under conditions that would have broken lesser men, and though some still harbored doubts about following a woman's leadership, those doubts were now tempered by the recognition that Nefertari had guided them through the crisis with skill and decisiveness that many male commanders might have lacked. Kabash approached her as she sat alone, reviewing the inventory lists that Jehudi had managed to update despite his injured arm, and the old guide lowered himself to the ground with the stiffness of age, his joints cracking audibly. And for a long moment he said nothing, simply stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, where the desert stretched endlessly, a black void dotted with stars so numerous and bright they seemed close enough to touch. And then he spoke in his rough voice, admitting that he had underestimated her, that his assumptions about women's capabilities had been challenged by her performance during the attack, and while he could not completely abandon beliefs that had been formed over a lifetime, he would try to trust her judgment more fully in the days ahead, and this awkward half-apology represented an enormous concession from such a proud and traditional man. The following days brought new challenges as they pushed deeper into the desert's heart, entering regions where the heat became a physical presence that pressed down upon them like the hand of an angry god, where the sand glittered with tiny crystals that reflected light into their eyes until vision became uncertain and the boundary between earth and sky blurred into a shimmering haze, where the air itself seemed to burn in their lungs, with each breath and sweat evaporated so quickly from skin that they existed in a state of constant dehydration despite drinking their rationed water. And Nefertari watched carefully for signs of heat stroke, that deadly condition where the body's cooling mechanisms failed and a man's mind began to dissolve, causing him to tear off his clothes and run laughing into the desert to die. And twice she had to physically restrain men who showed the early symptoms, holding them down while others poured precious water over their heads and bodies to lower their temperature, and she adjusted the traveling schedule to take advantage of the coolest hours, rising well before dawn, while stars still dominated the sky, and marching until mid-morning, then sheltering through the hottest part of the day under canvas awnings. Resuming travel in late afternoon and continuing into the early evening, this routine being more exhausting in some ways because it fragmented sleep and required the camp to be struck and made twice daily, but it reduced heat casualties significantly. On the 12th day, they reached the Wells of Hathor, a series of small springs that emerge. From rocks at the base of a rust-colored cliff. The water, brackish and warm, but drinkable. And this location was a traditional stopping point where caravans might encounter other travelers. And indeed, they found evidence of recent visitors, the ashes of fires, still showing some warmth, tracks in the sand indicating both men and camels, and most interestingly, a message left in the traditional way. Small stones arranged in patterns that those who knew the code could read, and Kabash studied these carefully before reporting that another caravan had passed heading west toward Thebes perhaps 2 days earlier. That they had spotted what they believed to be a large bandit force operating in the region ahead, and that they recommended detouring south, even though it would add significant distance to the journey. This intelligence created a heated debate around the evening fire, with a Menken arguing that detouring would consume water reserves that might be needed later, especially if they encountered unexpected difficulties, with some of the younger men insisting they had proven during the Wadi attack that they could defend themselves against bandits and should not show fear by running away, and with Kabash presenting both sides of the argument with professional detachment, but making clear through tone and gesture that he favored caution. Nefertari listened to all perspectives, asked probing questions about the southern route's water sources, the terrain challenges it would present, and the time it would add to their schedule, and she consulted the maps that her father had drawn based on his 7 crossings. Maps showing not just paths and landmarks but also notes about seasonal variations, historical incidents, and the territories claimed by various Bedouin tribes. And after this careful analysis, she made her decision. They would continue on the main route, but with enhanced security measures, including daily reconnaissance by their fastest riders on the best camels, staggered traveling formation that would prevent the entire caravan from being caught in a single ambush, and the establishment of emergency signals that could communicate danger instantly across the dispersed group. This decision was characteristic of Nefertari's leadership style. Neither rashly aggressive nor excessively cautious, but calculated based on all available information and adjusted to balance multiple competing priorities. And while it was impossible to say whether it was the right choice, since the alternatives could not be tested, it was a commander's choice, made with confidence and communicated with clarity, that allowed everyone to understand the reasoning and prepare accordingly. And this transparent decision-making process helped maintain the unity and morale that would be essential in the trials ahead. The 13th day brought an unexpected encounter when the forward scouts came racing back to report that a small group of travelers was approaching from the east. Not a caravan, but perhaps a dozen people on foot carrying minimal supplies. And when these strangers drew close enough to be observed clearly, they proved to be a family group of Egyptian miners who had been working at a turquoise mine in the mountains and were now returning home after their contracted period of labor, accompanied by 2 armed guards and led by the mining foreman, a thick-muscled man named Paneb, whose skin had been darkened to almost Nubian blackness by years under the desert sun. Paneb hailed the caravan with obvious relief, explaining that their situation was desperate because they had been attacked 3 days earlier by raiders who had taken most of their food and water, killed 1 guard, and wounded the other. And they had been rationing their remaining supplies to the point of starvation, hoping to encounter help before their strength failed completely. And he begged for assistance, offering in exchange information about the region ahead and several pieces of turquoise from his personal collection, stones of exceptional quality that would fetch high prices in Thebes's markets. Nefertari did not hesitate to offer aid, despite Amenken's whispered caution that their own supplies were calculated precisely for their own needs and that taking on additional mouths to feed could endanger the entire expedition. And she countered that the laws of Ma'at required helping those in distress, that leaving these people to die in the desert would bring the gods' curse upon their enterprise, and more practically, that the information Paneb could provide about recent bandit activity was worth more than the relatively small quantity of food and water the miners would consume during the 2 days they would travel together before their paths diverged, the miners heading northwest toward the Nile while the caravan continued east toward the Red Sea. The miners integrated into the caravan, and that evening Peneb provided a detailed account of his attack, describing the bandits as a mixed group of perhaps 40 men, including renegade Egyptians, Nubians, and even some Asiatics from beyond the Sinai, all united under the leadership of a former military officer named Userhet, who had deserted his post during a punitive expedition against the Nubians 5 years earlier. Taking his weapons and several followers with him, and establishing himself as a warlord in the desert, preying on caravans and mining expeditions, selling his plunder to corrupt officials in the port cities, who asked no questions about where goods originated. And Peneb warned that Userhet was no ordinary bandit, but a trained military tactician who used sophisticated strategies, including false trails, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, and even crude siege tactics when targeting fortified mining camps. This intelligence was deeply troubling because it suggested the threat level was higher than anyone had anticipated, and Nefertari called a council of her senior people, including Amenken, Kabash, the captain of her guards, and several of the more experienced merchants, and they debated options long into the night, with some arguing for turning back while they still could, others suggesting they should hire additional guards at the next settlement they encountered, even though this would significantly cut into profits, and Kabash proposing that they send a message to the military garrison at the port, requesting an escort for the final leg of the journey, though this would mean waiting for days or possibly weeks for such assistance to arrive. Nefertari rejected the idea of turning back because too much had already been invested in the expedition, and retreat would destroy her credibility, making future commercial ventures impossible. She was skeptical about finding suitable guards for hire in the small desert settlements that had few trained fighters, and those available were likely to be of questionable loyalty, and she was reluctant to commit to a long delay waiting for military escort, when the goods they carried included perishable items like honey that might spoil, and when every additional day in the desert increased the risk of heat, casualties, accidents, and supply depletion. So instead, she proposed accelerating their pace to reach the relative safety of the coastal region more quickly, even though this would mean pushing the men and animals harder, accepting more fatigue and stress in exchange for reducing the time spent in the danger zone where Userhet's bandits operated. Over the next several days, they implemented this grueling schedule, starting each day's march even earlier while the desert air still held the cold of night, maintaining movement through the morning until the heat became truly unbearable, taking only the minimum rest necessary during midday, and resuming travel in the afternoon until darkness made navigation too dangerous. And this relentless pace began to exact its toll. The animals developed sores despite careful attention to their loads and harnesses. Several men suffered from exhaustion-related ailments, including one case of complete collapse that required the victim to be lashed unconscious to a camel's back for 2 days while his body struggled to recover. And tempers grew short as fatigue eroded the patience and courtesy that normally governed interactions, leading to arguments over trivial matters that sometimes escalated to shoving matches requiring Nefertari's intervention. Yet they made remarkable progress, covering in 9 days a distance that might normally require 13 or 14, and their route took them through increasingly varied terrain, leaving behind the sand, seas, and entering regions of broken rock where the bones of the earth lay exposed in formations of twisted strata that recorded unimaginable ages, in colors ranging from rust red to ochre yellow to bands of white limestone that reflected the sun with blinding intensity. And then they climbed into genuine mountains, where the path became a narrow trail, clinging to cliff faces, with terrifying drops to one side. And here the camels proved their value, because these creatures from the northern deserts were surprisingly sure-footed on the rocky terrain, where donkeys would have balked and stumbled. And the caravan moved in single file with agonizing slowness, each step chosen carefully, because a single misstep could send animal and load tumbling down the mountainside. And in fact, they did lose one donkey this way, the poor beast placing its hoof on a loose rock that shifted, causing it to lose balance and slide over the edge with a desperate braying that ended suddenly when it struck the bottom of the ravine hundreds of feet below, its cargo of ceramic vessels shattering into countless pieces that would now remain scattered there until the mountains themselves eroded away. In the mountains they encountered their strangest and most wonderful sight of the entire journey when Kabash led them to a narrow canyon whose walls were covered with ancient paintings, images created by people who had lived in this region thousands of years ago when the climate had been wetter and the desert bloomed with vegetation that supported abundant wildlife. And the paintings showed hunters pursuing enormous animals, including elephants and giraffes that seemed impossible to imagine in the current barren landscape. There were scenes of dancing figures and mysterious symbols whose meanings were lost to time. There were handprints in ochre and white that represented individual human beings reaching across the centuries to prove that they had existed, that they had stood in this very spot and placed their hands upon the rock to leave a mark that would outlast their names, their culture, their entire civilization. And Nefertari found herself deeply moved by these images, feeling a profound connection to the artists who had created them, understanding that the human drive to explore, to trade, to venture into dangerous places in pursuit of gain or knowledge, or simply the need to see what lay beyond the next horizon, was not unique to her time, but was something ancient and essential to human nature. Jehudi spent hours copying some of the paintings into his record scrolls, despite his still healing arm causing him considerable pain, and he was particularly fascinated by what appeared to be a map showing various locations marked with different symbols, possibly indicating water sources, settlements, or sacred sites. And he speculated that if this map could be properly decoded, it might reveal routes and resources that were now forgotten, potentially offering safer or faster paths for future caravans. And Nefertari encouraged this documentation because she understood that knowledge was as valuable as any physical cargo, and that the more information traders accumulated about these remote regions, the more successfully they could operate in them. Descending from the mountains on the eastern side, they found themselves looking out over a landscape that was different from anything they had yet encountered. A vast plain of dark gravel and scattered rocks that stretched toward a horizon that seemed impossibly distant, and the air had changed, carrying a scent that was, at first, unidentifiable, but then Kabash announced with satisfaction that it was the smell of the sea. That salt tang carried on the wind from the Red Sea, which was still more than 2 days' journey ahead, but whose proximity promised that the worst of the desert crossing was behind them. And this news lifted spirits dramatically. Men who had been dragging themselves forward with grim determination suddenly found energy for songs and jokes, and even the animals seemed to sense that their ordeal was approaching its end. But it was precisely at this moment, when guards might be lowered and attention might waver, that Userhet's bandits struck with the timing and coordination that confirmed Peneb's description of their leader as a trained military tactician. The attack came not from one direction, but from 3 sides simultaneously. Bandits emerging from concealment behind rock formations where they must have been waiting patiently perhaps for hours, betting that a caravan following the standard route would pass this way. And their timing was calculated to catch the caravan in a vulnerable moment when it was strung out in traveling formation rather than consolidated for defense, and the initial assault was devastating. Arrows and spears flew from multiple directions, creating chaos and panic. Several animals were killed instantly, and others broke free in terror, dragging their loads and creating obstacles that disrupted any attempt at organized response. 2 guards fell in the first seconds of combat, with mortal wounds that left them thrashing in the blood-soaked gravel. And a group of bandits on fast camels made a direct charge at the center of the caravan, clearly intending to capture Nefertari herself, either for ransom or because Userhet had learned that this caravan was led by a woman and wanted to make an example that would discourage other females from assuming such roles. But if the bandits had expected easy victory, they had miscalculated, because despite the initial shock, Nefertari's people responded with the discipline of their training and the desperation of those who knew that surrender meant death or slavery. The guards who had drilled repeatedly in defensive formations fell into their assigned positions almost automatically, creating shield walls and covering fire that stalled the camel charge. Amenken, despite his age, seized a spear and led a counterattack against the bandits on the southern flank who had thought themselves safe from serious resistance. And Nefertari herself proved that she was not merely a commander but a fighter, using the composite bow that had been her father's to send arrow after arrow into the attackers with an accuracy that came from countless hours of practice in the courtyard of her Thebes home, and she became the rally point for her people, her voice cutting through the chaos, with commands that created order from potential disaster. The battle lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though to those involved, it seemed both endless and instantaneous, time becoming elastic under the stress of mortal combat. And the turning point came when Nocti, the Nubian archer, succeeded in killing the bandit sub-leader who was coordinating the attack from a prominent position atop a large boulder, the arrow taking him through the throat and dropping him instantly. And this death, combined with the unexpectedly fierce resistance, convinced the bandits that this prey was too dangerous, that they would suffer unacceptable casualties even if they eventually prevailed. And Userhet himself, who had been observing from a distance, made the calculation that would preserve his band to fight another day, giving the signal to withdraw, and the bandits disengaged with the same coordination they had shown in the attack, covering each other's retreat and taking their dead and wounded with them, so that the caravan could not even accurately count the casualties they had inflicted. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, and silence returned to the battlefield, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of those still processing the adrenaline of combat, Nefertari conducted a rapid assessment of their situation and found it serious but not catastrophic. They had lost 4 men killed and 7 wounded, with varying degrees of severity. They had lost 9 animals, including several camels, which was a significant blow to their carrying capacity, and worst of all, they had lost a substantial portion of their water supply when several large vessels had been shattered by weapons or trampled by panicked animals. This water loss being potentially more dangerous than all the other casualties combined, because it meant their calculations about reaching the Red Sea ports were no longer valid, and they would need to either find additional water sources or push even harder to reach the coast before dehydration became critical. Nefertari made the decision that would define her leadership and ultimately determine whether the expedition succeeded or failed. She announced that they would not rest to recover from the battle, but would immediately continue toward the coast at maximum sustainable pace, that every hour of delay increased their risk because Userhet might return with reinforcements, or another bandit group might attack while they were weakened, and that their best chance of survival lay in reaching the coast before their water ran out, which meant covering the remaining distance in perhaps 30 hours of actual marching time, and brutal pace that would push everyone to their absolute limits, but was achievable if they could maintain discipline and determination. Some of the men looked at her as if she had gone mad, arguing that both people and animals needed rest after the trauma of battle, that pushing forward in their current state would lead to more casualties from exhaustion and accidents than from any bandit attack. But others understood the cold logic of her reasoning, recognized that their water situation left no room for lengthy rest, and Amenken sided with her decisively, stating in terms that all could hear that he had initially doubted a woman's ability to lead such an expedition, but that Nefertari had proven herself superior to most male commanders he had known, that her judgment should be trusted even when it seemed harsh, and this endorsement from a respected senior merchant helped swing opinion among the wavering men. They marched through the afternoon as the sun declined toward the western horizon behind them, casting their shadows long and distorted across the gravel plain. They marched through the evening as stars emerged, and the temperature plummeted from furnace heat to bitter cold that made teeth chatter and forced them to wrap themselves in every bit of cloth they possessed. They marched through the night, guided by the stars, and by Kabash's seemingly supernatural ability to detect the subtle variations in terrain that marked the route even in darkness. And they marched through the following dawn, as the sun rose ahead of them, painting the sky in colors ranging from deep purple to crimson to gold, and men walked in states of semi-consciousness, driven forward by will alone since physical energy had been exhausted hours earlier, and the animals stumbled frequently, requiring constant attention from handlers who themselves could barely stand. And Nefertari walked among them, offering encouragement, physical support, when someone faltered, sharing the last of her personal water ration with a young servant who was on the verge of collapse, and her presence, her refusal to ride when everyone else walked, her evident determination to share every hardship rather than claiming privileges of rank, created a bond between leader and led that transcended normal commercial relationships and approached something sacred, a shared ordeal that would unite these people for the rest of their lives. It was mid-morning of that second day of continuous marching when the forward scouts sent up a cry that galvanized the last reserves of energy in every exhausted body, for they had spotted the sea, not the water itself yet, but the unmistakable signs, the vegetation that appeared wherever groundwater came near the surface, creating scattered bushes and even small trees. The change in bird life from desert scavengers to seabirds, whose presence absolutely confirmed proximity to the coast. And then, as they crested a final rise, they saw it, the Red Sea stretching to the eastern horizon in a vast expanse of blue-green water that seemed to glow with impossible brightness after so many days surrounded by brown and gray desert, and the sight was so overwhelming that several men actually wept. Tears cutting tracks through the dust caked on their faces, and they increased their pace despite exhaustion to cover the final leagues that separated them from salvation. The port settlement of Mursa Gawasses appeared as a cluster of buildings huddled against the shoreline, where a natural inlet provided protection for ships. It was not a large community, perhaps 200 permanent residents, mostly involved in fishing, boat building, and servicing the trading vessels that called at this remote location, but to the caravan it looked like the most beautiful place in the world. And they were greeted by the portmaster, a Greek merchant who had established himself here decades earlier, and now served as the primary intermediary between Egyptian traders and the foreign merchants who arrived with goods from Punt, Arabia, and even more distant lands. And he welcomed Nefertari with professional courtesy that showed no surprise at her gender. For in these cosmopolitan port communities, where countless cultures mixed and mingled, unusual arrangements were commonplace, and judgment was reserved for commercial competence rather than adherence to traditional social structures. The first priority was water and rest, and the caravan was directed to a compound where they could secure their animals and goods, where there was a well of sweet water fed by a spring that never failed even in the driest seasons, and where they could bathe in the sea, washing away not just the physical dirt of their journey, but also the spiritual pollution that came from violence and death. And Nefertari insisted that the wounded receive attention before anything else, hiring a local physician who had experience treating the injuries common to desert travelers and sailors, and under his care even the most seriously wounded began to stabilize, receiving proper cleaning of their injuries, fresh bandages, and medicines, including moldy bread applied to wounds to prevent infection, a treatment that seemed like folk magic but that Nefertari had seen work many times. Over the following days, Nefertari threw herself into the commercial negotiations that were the entire purpose of the expedition, meeting with the foreign merchants whose ships crowded the harbor, examining their goods with the expert eye she had developed under her father's tutelage, assessing quality, calculating fair prices, and engaging in the elaborate dance of bargaining, where the first price mentioned was never the final price, where insults and dramatic gestures were part of the game, where walking away from a negotiation was a tactic rather than a genuine ending, and where the successful trader needed equal parts knowledge, patience, and theatrical skill. The foreign merchants brought treasures that made the entire deadly journey worthwhile. There was frankincense and myrrh from the land of Punt, those aromatic resins that were essential for religious ceremonies, that filled temples with fragrant smoke, believed to carry prayers to the gods, and that were also valued for medicinal properties and for perfume creation. There were bolts of fine cotton from lands far to the east, beyond even the knowledge of Egyptian geography. Fabric softer and lighter than linen, though not as durable. There were spices, including black pepper, cinnamon, and cardamom, that would transform the bland porridges and breads that constituted most Egyptian diet into dishes of complex flavor. There were exotic woods, including ebony and teak, that could be carved into furniture for the wealthiest nobles. There were semi-precious stones, including carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli, that jewelers would transform into necklaces, rings, and amulets. And most spectacularly, there were several small elephant tusks of ivory so white it seemed to glow, material that was rarer than gold and could be carved into ornaments of breathtaking delicacy. Nefertari negotiated purchases carefully, balancing the desire to acquire the most profitable goods against the capacity limits imposed by their reduced number of pack animals and the need to reserve some carrying capacity for food and water for the return journey. And she demonstrated her commercial acumen by identifying several lots of merchandise that other traders had overlooked, spices that were labeled incorrectly and priced below their true value, a collection of copper ingots from Cyprus that the seller was eager to move quickly and therefore offered at a significant discount. And most cleverly, she arranged a complex three-way trade where she exchanged Egyptian linen and bronze tools, not for immediate goods, but for a letter of credit with a merchant house in Byblos, a Phoenician port city, which could then be redeemed by Egyptian traders who operated along the Mediterranean coast, effectively converting her goods into a financial instrument that had no weight and could not be stolen by bandits, though it did require trust in the commercial networks that spanned the ancient world. As the trading progressed and Nefertari's reputation for shrewd but fair dealing spread through the port community, she was approached by representatives of several foreign merchants with a proposition that was both flattering and potentially very profitable. They suggested that rather than simply trading on this single occasion, Nefertari should consider establishing a permanent trading relationship where she would serve as their exclusive Egyptian agent, receiving goods on consignment, selling them in Thebes and other Nile cities, and remitting the proceeds minus her commission. And in exchange, they would give her access to merchandise before other traders saw it, would offer better prices, and would provide information about market conditions in their home regions that could guide her purchasing decisions. This offer represented a significant opportunity because it would transform her from a single expedition trader into an ongoing commercial operation with regular income and reduced risk, since she would not need to invest her own capital in purchasing goods up front. But it also carried dangers because the consignment model meant she would be responsible for goods until they were sold and would bear losses from theft, damage, or market downturns. And there was also the question of whether foreign merchants would truly honor their commitments to someone operating thousands of miles away in a different land under different laws where they had no ability to enforce contracts if disputes arose. Nefertari requested time to consider this offer, and she consulted with a Menken whose decades of trading experience made him a valuable advisor. And the old merchant was characteristically blunt, pointing out that many such arrangements had failed when the foreign merchants proved unreliable or when market conditions changed in ways that made the relationship unprofitable. But he also acknowledged that the most successful trading houses in Egypt had built their wealth on exactly such ongoing relationships, that the key was choosing partners carefully, starting with small transactions to test reliability before committing to larger deals, and maintaining meticulous records so that any discrepancies could be identified and addressed before they became serious problems. After 2 days of reflection and investigation, making discreet inquiries about the reputation of the merchants who had approached her, examining samples of their goods to assess quality consistency, and consulting with the portmaster who knew the history of every trader who used this harbor, Nefertari made her decision. She would accept the offer, but on a limited trial basis, agreeing to take one shipment of goods on consignment and see how the relationship developed before committing to anything more extensive. And this cautious approach satisfied both her ambition to expand her business and her prudent recognition that unknown partnerships carried inherent risks. The return journey began on an auspicious day selected after consultation with the priest of Hathor, who maintained a small shrine at the port, and the caravan that departed Mursa Gawasis was in much better condition than the battered group that had arrived. The men were rested and well fed. Their wounds had healed, or at least stabilized. The animals had recovered their strength on good fodder and abundant water, and most importantly, their loads now consisted of high-value trade goods that would generate substantial profits when sold in Thebes, profits that would enrich not just Nefertari but all the merchants who had invested in the expedition and the men who would receive their promised shares. Nefertari had used some of her trading capital to hire additional guards, 6 tough Nubian mercenaries who had been working as ship security and were willing to make the desert crossing in exchange for generous pay. And she had also purchased 3 additional camels to replace those lost in the bandit attack. And these practical measures significantly strengthened the caravan's defensive capabilities and carrying capacity. But the greatest change was in the caravan's morale and cohesion. For the shared ordeals of the outbound journey had forged this collection of merchants, servants, and laborers into something like a military unit, bound by mutual respect and trust that had been tested in combat and crisis. The return route followed a different path than the outbound journey, swinging somewhat to the north to avoid the territories where Userhet's bandits operated and to take advantage of a series of wells that Kabosh knew from previous expeditions. And this route was longer in terms of distance, but actually faster in terms of travel time because it avoided the mountainous terrain and allowed them to maintain a steady pace across relatively flat desert. And the different landscape also provided different views, including a region where the desert floor was covered with what appeared to be black stones, but which Kabosh explained were actually the product of ancient volcanic activity, rocks that had been melted by heat beyond imagining, and then cooled into these dark, glossy forms. And Jehudi collected several samples, which he planned to show to the scholars at the House of Life in Thebes. Speculating that these stones might have properties useful for tool-making or construction, they encountered other travelers on this northern route, including a small caravan of Bedouin traders heading east with loads of dried fish and grain to exchange for the products of Arabia. And these Bedouins shared news from the region, including a report that there had been a major battle between two bandit groups fighting over territory and water rights, a battle that had left many dead and had caused the survivors to retreat to their strongholds to recover. And this information suggested that the return journey might be less dangerous than the outbound leg had been, simply because the bandit forces were currently focused on their internal conflicts rather than on raiding caravans, though Nefertari warned against complacency since desperate bandits who had suffered losses might be even more aggressive in seeking to recoup their fortunes. On the 8th day of the return journey, they reached the wells of Hathor, where they had stopped on the outbound journey, and they found the wells occupied by a large caravan heading east, a group of nearly 100 people with twice that many animals, a massive enterprise organized by a consortium of 3 major Theban merchant houses who had pooled their resources for this trading season. And the leader of this caravan was a merchant named Herihor, whom Nefertari knew slightly from the markets of Thebes, a pompous man who had inherited his father's business and maintained it through conservative strategies that generated modest but reliable profits. And his reaction upon discovering that Nefertari had successfully completed an eastbound journey and was now returning with valuable trade goods was a complex mixture of surprise, skepticism, and poorly concealed irritation that a woman had succeeded in an enterprise he had publicly predicted would fail. Herihor insisted on inspecting Nefertari's trade goods, ostensibly to assess market conditions and pricing, but really to verify that she had genuinely succeeded and was not perpetrating some elaborate fraud, and his examination of the frankincense, spices, and ivory confirmed their quality and authenticity, and he was forced to acknowledge her success, though he did so with qualifications and caveats, suggesting that she had been lucky in her timing, that the true test would be whether she could repeat the success in future seasons, and that leading one caravan hardly established a permanent reputation. And Nefertari bore these patronizing comments with outer patience, while internally fuming at the double standard that required women to prove themselves repeatedly, while men were assumed competent based on their gender alone. That evening, the 2 caravans camped together around the wells, and after the formal meal, where the leaders sat together sharing food in the ritualistic manner that acknowledged their common membership in the merchant class despite their competitive relationship, Nefertari found herself in conversation with several of the younger merchants from Herihor's caravan, men who were genuinely interested in her experiences and who asked detailed questions about routes, water sources, bandit encounters, and trading conditions at the ports. And she shared this information generously because the desert was dangerous enough without traders hoarding knowledge that might save lives. And she also understood that these young merchants represented the future of Egyptian trade and that some of them might become valuable partners or allies in her own future ventures. And indeed, 2 of them privately approached her to discuss the possibility of joining her next expedition rather than continuing to work for Herihor, whose conservative approach and condescending manner had left them hungry for more dynamic leadership. The final leg of the journey passed almost without incident, the caravan following well-traveled routes through increasingly familiar territory as they approached the Nile Valley. And the transition from the red land back to the black land was like emerging from a nightmare into a beautiful dream. The green fields and palm trees, the smell of the river and growing crops, the sounds of birds and domestic animals and human activity all seemed almost unbearably wonderful after the harsh silence and barren landscapes of the desert. And when the walls and temples of Thebes finally came into view across the river, several of the men actually knelt in prayer, thanking the gods for their safe return and acknowledging that they had survived trials that killed many who attempted them. The caravan's arrival in Thebes created a sensation, word having spread through the merchant community that Nefertari had successfully completed her expedition despite all predictions of failure, and a crowd gathered to witness the unpacking of her trade goods, to hear stories of the journey, and to assess whether this woman's success represented a peculiar anomaly or whether it might indicate that traditional assumptions about women's capabilities needed to be reconsidered. And Nefertari handled this attention with the diplomatic skill that was becoming her trademark, neither boasting about her achievements nor falsely minimizing them, but simply presenting the facts, showing the high-quality goods she had acquired, acknowledging the contributions of all who had participated in the expedition, and making it clear that she intended this to be the first of many such ventures. The profits from the expedition exceeded even Nefertari's optimistic projections. The frankincense and myrrh sold to temple authorities at prices that were 30% higher than she had anticipated because a recent diplomatic dispute had interrupted supplies from alternative sources. The spices attracted intense bidding among wealthy nobles who competed to serve the most exotic dishes at their banquets. The ivory was purchased by the royal workshops where it would be carved into ornaments for the pharaoh's palace, and the various other goods, including the copper ingots and the consignment merchandise, all found eager buyers, and after paying all her investors their promised returns, compensating the families of the men who had died during the journey, distributing shares to the surviving caravan members, and covering all expenses, Nefertari found herself with a personal profit that tripled her initial wealth and established her as one of the most successful merchants in Thebes. More valuable than the monetary profit was the reputation she had earned, for in a society that depended heavily on personal relationships and trust, being known as someone who could successfully organize and lead a dangerous expedition, who kept her promises to investors and workers, who showed courage in crisis and wisdom in planning, opened doors that had previously been closed, she found herself invited to join the merchant council that advised the pharaoh's officials on commercial matters. She was consulted by other traders planning their own expeditions, and perhaps most satisfying, she began to receive discreet inquiries from the fathers and brothers of young women who wondered if Nefertari might be willing to accept apprentices who could learn the trading business under her guidance, suggesting that her success was inspiring other families to reconsider the possibilities for their daughters. In the months following her return, Nefertari organized 2 more expeditions, both successful, though neither quite as dramatic as the first, and she began to develop the permanent trading network she had envisioned, establishing relationships with foreign merchants, investing in warehouse facilities near the Thebes docks, hiring permanent staff including scribes, guards, and agents who could represent her interests when she could not be present personally, and gradually transforming what had been a single expedition venture into an ongoing commercial enterprise that would endure beyond her own active participation and that she hoped eventually to pass on to her own children. pharaohs. She had recently married Amenemopet, a ship captain who commanded one of the vessels that sailed between Thebes and the Mediterranean ports, a man whose respect for her abilities matched her respect for his, and together they dreamed of building a trading empire that would span from the heart of Egypt to the farthest reaches of the known world. And as she stood on the roof of her expanded house in the cool evenings, watching the sun set over the western desert while the river flowed eternal and unchanging beside the city, she reflected on how the journey that had seemed so impossible and that many had predicted would end in disaster had actually been the beginning of something remarkable. Proof that the boundaries that societies placed on what women could achieve were not reflections of true capability, but merely traditions that could be challenged and overcome through courage, skill, and the willingness to risk everything in pursuit of a vision that others could not see. Yet success brought complications that Nefertari had not anticipated, for as her wealth and influence grew, So too did the envy and resentment of those who saw her achievements not as inspiration, but as a threat to the established order. And chief among these antagonists was Ptahshepses, a merchant of ancient lineage whose family had controlled much of Thebes's desert trade for 3 generations and who viewed Nefertari's success as a direct challenge to his commercial dominance. And he began a campaign of subtle sabotage designed to undermine her business without leaving evidence that could be traced back to him, spreading rumors that her trade goods were of inferior quality, that she had bribed officials to secure favorable treatment, that her foreign partners were unreliable criminals who would eventually betray her, and most insidiously, that her success was not due to skill or knowledge, but to intimate relationships with the men in her caravans, a slander that played upon the deepest prejudices about women in positions of authority, and that was impossible to definitively disprove, since absence of evidence could always be interpreted as evidence of clever concealment. These whispered accusations circulated through the merchant community like poison in water, invisible but deadly, and Nefertari began to notice their effects when some of her regular customers became hesitant to purchase from her, when potential investors withdrew from a new expedition she was planning, and most painfully, when the merchant council that had invited her to join their ranks now treated her with cool formality rather than the collegial warmth she had previously enjoyed. And she realized that Ptahshepses' strategy was working precisely because it operated in the realm of reputation and social perception, where direct confrontation was impossible and where a woman's credibility was always more fragile than a man's. And she understood that if she did not find a way to counter these attacks, her entire enterprise could collapse, not through any failure of her own, but through the accumulated weight of innuendo and suspicion. Nefertari's response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made her successful in the first place. Rather than directly confronting Ptahshepses, which would have been seen as a woman becoming emotionally overwrought and would have reinforced stereotypes about female irrationality, she instead focused on demonstrating through actions the falsity of the rumors. She invited respected neutral parties, including priests and royal officials, to inspect her warehouses and verify the quality of her goods. She made her business records available for examination by the Merchant Council's auditors, who confirmed that all her transactions were properly documented and legitimate. And most effectively, she organized a grand expedition that would be so transparent and so well documented that no one could question its integrity. An expedition that would include representatives from several merchant houses, including some who were allied with Ptahshepses, thereby forcing them to either participate and witness her methods firsthand or refuse and appear afraid of what they might discover. This expedition was planned for the winter season, when the desert temperatures were more moderate, but when sandstorms were more frequent, a calculated risk that would demonstrate her willingness to tackle difficult challenges. And the destination was not the Red Sea ports, which had become familiar territory, but rather the mysterious land of Punt itself, a destination that lay far to the south, along the coast of the Great Green Sea. A journey that would require not just desert crossing, but also sea voyage, and that would bring back treasures even more exotic and valuable than those available at the intermediate ports. And the audacity of this plan captured the imagination of Thebes's commercial community. For Punt was a semi-legendary place that appeared in ancient texts and temple inscriptions, but that few living merchants had actually visited. A land said to be rich beyond measure in gold, ivory, exotic animals, including leopards and baboons, and most precious of all, the finest frankincense and myrrh that came from trees growing nowhere else in the world, trees that were said to be gifts from the gods themselves planted in soil sacred to Hathor. The preparations for this expedition required months of intensive work, for the scale was unprecedented in Nefertari's career, requiring not just the assembly of a large caravan, but also the chartering of ships, the recruitment of experienced sailors who knew the southern waters, the stockpiling of trade goods that would appeal to the sophisticated merchants of Punt who had seen countless Egyptian traders and would not be impressed by ordinary offerings, and the navigation of complex diplomatic requirements, since Punt was an independent kingdom with its own rulers and customs that had to be respected. And Nefertari threw herself into these preparations with an intensity that left little time for sleep or personal matters, working from dawn until long after dark, consulting with ship captains, examining cargo manifests, interviewing potential expedition members, and studying every scrap of information about Punt that could be found in temple libraries or extracted from the memories of old sailors who had made the journey in their youth. Among the recruits for this expedition was a man who would prove to be both an invaluable asset and a source of considerable personal complication. His name was Senenmut, and he was a former military officer who had served with distinction in the pharaoh's Nubian campaigns before retiring to pursue commercial ventures. And he possessed exactly the combination of skills that Nefertari needed: military experience to organize security and defensive measures, leadership ability to command respect from the rough men who would make up much of the expedition, and crucial knowledge of ship-based operations, since his military service had included commanding river transports during supply missions. And when he presented himself at Nefertari's house requesting to join the expedition, she recognized immediately that his participation would significantly increase their chances of success, but she also recognized something else in the way his eyes met hers with unusual directness, the way his voice carried a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy, and the way he listened to her ideas with an attention that suggested genuine interest rather than the patronizing tolerance that many men showed toward women's speech. And she understood that hiring him would mean navigating not just the professional relationship of commander and subordinate, but also the personal attraction that clearly existed between them, an attraction made more complicated by her recent marriage to Amenemopet, who was away on an extended trading voyage to Cyprus and would not return for several months. Nefertari made the pragmatic decision to hire Senenmut despite the personal complications, reasoning that the expedition's success had to take precedence over emotional concerns, and she established clear professional boundaries, making it explicit that their relationship would be purely focused on the expedition's objectives and that any other considerations would have to wait until after their return if they proved relevant at all. And Senenmut accepted these terms with grace, though his eyes suggested that he considered the matter postponed rather than concluded. And he immediately demonstrated his value by reorganizing the security arrangements in ways that addressed vulnerabilities Nefertari had not even recognized, doubling the guard rotations, implementing a system of signals that would allow rapid communication across the entire expedition even in the chaos of battle, and personally training the guards in coordinated defensive tactics that could transform a group of individual fighters into a cohesive military unit. The departure from Thebes was an event of such spectacle that it attracted not just the merchant community, but also nobles, priests, and even representatives of the pharaoh's court, who came to witness what was being called the most ambitious private trading expedition in a generation. And Nefertari stood before this assembled crowd dressed in fine linen that had been pleated and starched to perfection, wearing jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli that proclaimed her wealth and status, and she spoke with a confidence that came from knowing she had prepared as thoroughly as possible for every contingency, dedicating the expedition to Hathor, the goddess of foreign lands, and to Ma'at, the principle of truth and justice that should govern all human endeavors, and promising that she would return with treasures that would enrich Thebes and demonstrate the capability of Egyptian commerce to reach even the most distant markets. And as the great caravan began to move, its line stretching for nearly a quarter mile, with 60 pack animals, 42 men, 4 ships waiting at the river docks to carry them south, and goods valued at what a skilled craftsman might earn in 20 years of labor. She felt the weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders like a physical burden. For this expedition represented not just her own fortune and reputation, but also the invested capital of dozens of other merchants, the livelihoods of the men who had entrusted their lives to her leadership, and in a larger sense, the question of whether women could truly compete in the most demanding arenas of Egyptian society. The journey down the Nile to the river's delta, where it spread into countless channels before emptying into the Great Green Sea, was itself an adventure, taking 12 days, during which the expedition traveled on the 4 ships that Nefertari had chartered, broad-beamed cargo vessels that could carry substantial loads but that were slow and ungainly, requiring skilled handling to navigate the river's currents and the constant river traffic of fishing boats, royal barges, military transports, and other merchant vessels. And during these days, Nefertari had the opportunity to observe how the expedition's members interacted, to identify potential problems before they became serious, and to refine the organizational structures that would govern their activities once they reached the more dangerous phases of the journey. And she was pleased to note that Senenmut had quickly earned the respect of the men through a combination of military bearing, practical competence, and a leadership style that was firm but not harsh. And she was less pleased to notice that he seemed to have an instinctive understanding of her own moods and thoughts, often anticipating her decisions or concerns before she voiced them, creating a sense of partnership that was professionally valuable but personally unsettling given the boundaries she had tried to establish. At the river's mouth, they transferred their goods to two larger seagoing vessels that had been specially prepared for the voyage, ships with higher sides to handle the waves of open water, with reinforced hulls to survive potential storms, and with experienced crews who knew the coastal routes and the seasonal patterns of winds and currents that could make the difference between a swift voyage and a deadly disaster. And the captains of these vessels were brothers from a family that had been involved in maritime trade for generations, men named Othmose the Elder and Othmose the Younger, and they regarded Nefertari with the practical assessment of sailors who judged people by their competence rather than their gender. And after questioning her extensively about her navigation knowledge, her understanding of maritime risks, and her plans for dealing with various emergency scenarios, they pronounced themselves satisfied that she knew what she was doing and pledged their full cooperation. And this endorsement from such respected maritime professionals helped to further solidify her authority over the expedition. The sea voyage began auspiciously with favorable winds that filled the ship's square sails and drove them south along the coast at speeds that would have been impossible to achieve by land, and for several days the journey proceeded almost pleasantly. The gentle rocking of the ships, the smell of salt air, the sight of dolphins playing in the bow waves, and the sound of the sailors singing work songs as they managed the rigging created an atmosphere more of adventure than danger. And Nefertari found herself relaxing slightly, allowing herself to appreciate the beauty of the vast water that stretched to the eastern horizon in an endless expanse of blue, and the spectacular sunrises that painted the sky in colors she had never seen in the desert. And during these peaceful hours, she often stood at the ship's rail, watching the coastline slide past, sometimes seeing fishing villages or small ports, sometimes seeing nothing but empty beaches and rocky cliffs, and occasionally spotting the ruins of ancient structures whose purposes and builders had been forgotten by time. But the sea's moods were changeable, and on the seventh day of the voyage, the weather shifted ominously, the sky taking on a greenish cast that the sailors recognized as a storm warning. And Captain Ahmose the Elder immediately ordered preparations, securing all loose cargo, checking the integrity of the rigging, and distributing lengths of rope that passengers could use to tie themselves to fixed points on the ship to avoid being washed overboard when the waves became violent. And he explained to Nefertari that they had two choices. They could attempt to reach a protected anchorage that lay perhaps 3 hours ahead, where they might wait out the storm in relative safety, or they could turn west and beach the ships on the coastline, accepting the risk of damage but eliminating the possibility of sinking in deep water. And Nefertari consulted with Senenmut and her other senior advisors before making the decision to race for the protected anchorage, betting that the storm would not strike with full force before they could reach shelter. A calculated gamble that would save time if successful, but could prove catastrophic if the weather deteriorated faster than anticipated. They almost made it, the ships running before the rising wind with every scrap of sail deployed, the crews working frantically to maintain control as the waves grew larger and more chaotic, the sky darkening to the color of bruised flesh while lightning flickered on the horizon, and Nefertari stood amidships, gripping a rope while spray soaked her clothes and the ship pitched and rolled in ways that made her stun. Omak revolt, and she could see the entrance to the anchorage ahead, a gap between rocky promontories that promised safety if they could just reach it. But the storm arrived with shocking suddenness, transforming in moments from a threatening presence to a howling fury that tore at the sails with wind that felt solid as fists, that raised waves as tall as houses, and that drove rain with such force that it felt like being struck by thousands of tiny stones, and in these conditions navigation became nearly impossible, the helmsman fighting to keep the ships pointed toward the anchorage entrance while the wind tried to drive them onto the rocks. And Nefertari heard Captain Ahmose shouting orders that were barely audible over the storm's roar. And then came the sickening sound of tearing fabric as the mainsail ripped apart, the wind catching the weakened material and shredding it like papyrus. And suddenly the ship was out of control, wallowing in the troughs between waves. And the second ship, commanded by Ahmosi the Younger, disappeared behind a wall of water, and for several terrifying minutes, Nefertari thought they would capsize, or be driven onto the rocks, or simply be swallowed by the sea. And she found herself praying to every god she could name, promising offerings and dedications if they would only preserve the expedition, and whether through divine intervention or the incredible skill of Captain Ahmosi and his crew, the ship somehow clawed its way through the anchorage entrance into calmer water where the surrounding rocks broke the worst of the waves, and they dropped anchor and rode out the remainder of the storm in conditions that were still violent but no longer immediately life-threatening. And when the wind finally began to diminish and visibility improved, they could see the second ship had also made it through and was anchored perhaps 100 yards away, battered but intact. And the relief was so overwhelming that several men collapsed, weeping while others laughed hysterically, the emotional release of surviving what they had believed would be their deaths. The damage assessment revealed that while both ships had survived, they had suffered losses and injuries. One sailor had been washed overboard and drowned during the height of the storm. Several others had been injured by falling, rigging, or cargo that had broken free despite the securing efforts. And some of the trade goods had been damaged by water that had penetrated the holds. And perhaps most seriously, both ships had sustained damage to their sails and rigging that would require several days of repairs before they could safely continue the voyage. And this delay was frustrating, but unavoidable. And Nefertari used the time to conduct a thorough inspection of all equipment and supplies, to reorganize cargo in ways that would better distribute weight and reduce the risk of shifting during rough weather, and to address the morale issues that had emerged during the storm when the proximity of death had shaken even the most experienced sailors. It was during this period of repairs and reorganization that Nefertari's complicated relationship with Senenmut reached a crisis point, for he had been injured during the storm, taking a blow to the head from a swinging cargo net that had left him dazed and bleeding, and Nefertari had personally tended to his wounds, cleaning the gash in his scalp and binding it with linen, while he sat uncharacteristically quiet and vulnerable. And in that moment of physical intimacy, with her hands on his head and his eyes looking up at her with unmistakable emotion, the professional boundaries she had tried to maintain simply dissolved, and she fell. Endi herself, acknowledging what she had been denying since he first joined the expedition, that she felt a connection to him that went far beyond commander and subordinate, that his presence made her feel more complete than she had felt in years, and that the marriage she had made to Amenemopet, while practical and based on genuine respect, lacked the passionate intensity that she now realized she craved. And Senenmut spoke quietly, his words careful and respectful, acknowledging that he understood she was married and that he would never try to force her into a position that would compromise her honor or reputation, but also making clear that his feelings for her were deep and genuine, that he admired not just her beauty, but her intelligence and courage and the strength of character that had driven her to achieve what no other woman in Thebes had accomplished. And he said that he would accept whatever relationship she was willing to offer, whether that was purely professional partnership, friendship, or something more intimate, but that he wanted her to know that his commitment to her and to the expedition was absolute, regardless of her decision. Nefertari did not respond immediately, needing time to process the conflicting emotions and practical considerations that swirled through her mind. And she told Senenmut that she needed to think carefully about what he had said, that decisions made in the emotional aftermath of surviving a storm might not reflect true judgment, and that they should revisit this conversation after the expedition had reached Punt and the immediate pressures had eased, and he accepted this with understanding, and they returned to their professional roles, though now with an undercurrent of acknowledged attraction that made every interaction carry additional weight and meaning. And Nefertari found herself both energized and distracted by this development, sometimes catching herself watching Senenmut as he drilled the guards or organized the cargo loading, and then having to force her attention back to the practical matters that demanded her focus. And she recognized that she was treading dangerous ground where personal desires and professional responsibilities were becoming entangled in ways that could lead to disaster if not carefully managed. The repaired ships resumed the southward voyage with greater caution, the captains keeping closer to shore and being prepared to beach the vessels at the first sign of deteriorating weather. And this conservative approach meant slower progress, but also reduced risk. And over the following weeks, they passed landmarks that were recorded in ancient texts, the ruins of a Phoenician trading post that had been abandoned when the local water supply failed, a massive rock formation that resembled the head of a lion and that sailors used as a navigation marker, and eventually, the climate began to change noticeably, the air becoming more humid and the vegetation along the coastline becoming more lush with trees and plants that did not exist in Egypt proper, and the sailors explained that they were entering the regions where the world's weather patterns shifted, where the dry desert winds gave way to moisture-laden breezes from the southern seas, and where the land supported not just scattered thorny bushes, but actual forests with trees that remained green year-round regardless of the seasons. The port of Punt, when they finally reached it, was unlike anything Nefertari had seen in the Egyptian or Eastern Mediterranean trading centers. Rather than a concentrated settlement, it was more of a scattered community that extended along several miles of coastline, with buildings constructed from wood and palm fronds rather than mud, brick, or stone, with the people themselves being distinctive in appearance, taller on average than Egyptians, with skin tones ranging from deep brown to almost black, and with customs and language that were clearly related to Egyptian culture but that had evolved in unique directions during centuries of relative isolation. And the merchant prince who controlled trade in this region was named Pharaoh, and he received Nefertari's delegation with ceremonial formality that included offerings of incense, the presentation of gifts, including finely carved wooden figures and bowls of aromatic spices, and a feast where the foods were so exotic that Nefertari could barely identify what she was eating, though she found most of it delicious, if occasionally alarming in appearance or texture. The trading negotiations in Punt were unlike those Nefertari had experienced elsewhere, because Parehu and his subordinates were not primarily interested in accumulating wealth in the conventional sense, but rather in acquiring specific items that had ritual or cultural significance. They were far more interested in Egyptian linen and bronze implements than in gold or precious stones. They valued items associated with the pharaoh or Egyptian temples because these carried spiritual power in their belief system. And they had an elaborate protocol for negotiations that required each trading session to be preceded by prayers and offerings to their gods, and Nefertari quickly adapted to these customs, showing respect for their traditions even when she did not fully understand them. And this cultural sensitivity won her Parehu's approval, and created a relationship that went beyond simple commercial transaction to something approaching genuine friendship, and he began to share information about trade routes that extended even further south to lands that Egyptians had never visited, and about exotic goods that could be obtained through intermediaries if one was willing to be patient and to pay premium prices. Among the treasures that Nefertari acquired in Punt were quantities of frankincense and myrrh that would have taken 10 ordinary caravans to transport, ivory tusks from elephants of such size that they were almost too heavy for 2 men to lift, living exotic birds with plumage of brilliant colors that could be sold to nobles who maintained private menageries, several trained baboons that would fascinate the pharaoh's court, and most spectacularly, 3 live leopards captured as cubs and raised to relative tameness, animals sacred to several Egyptian deities and so rare in captivity that their value was almost incalculable. And beyond these physical goods, Nefertari also acquired something perhaps more valuable: detailed information about trade networks that extended to the southern reaches of the world, about goods and markets that no Egyptian merchant had yet exploited, and about opportunities for future voyages that could establish Thebes as the center of a trading empire spanning continents. The return voyage was accomplished with greater ease than the outbound journey because the seasonal winds had shifted to favor northward travel, and because the crews now had experience with the ships and with working together, making them more efficient in handling routine operations and more coordinated in responding to emergencies. And the journey back to the Nile Delta required only 2/3 the time that the southbound voyage had taken. And when they finally sailed into the river and began the journey upstream toward Thebes, Nefertari allowed herself to feel the first stirrings of triumph, knowing that the expedition had succeeded beyond her most optimistic projections, that the goods they carried would generate enormous profits, and that she had accomplished something that would be recorded in the annals of Egyptian commerce and that would be discussed for generations as an example of what determined leadership could achieve. The arrival in Thebes created a sensation that exceeded even the spectacular departure, for word had spread through mysterious channels as news always did in Egypt, and people lined the riverbanks to watch the ships pass, to see the exotic animals and the mountains of precious cargo, and to catch a glimpse of the woman who had led this extraordinary venture. And when the ships finally docked at the commercial wharves, there was such a crowd that the city guards had to establish a perimeter to prevent people from swarming the vessels and potentially causing injuries or damage. And Nefertari emerged onto the dock, dressed in her finest garments, with jewelry that proclaimed her success. And she was greeted by a delegation that included not just merchants and nobles, but also priests from the major temples and even a representative of the pharaoh himself, who conveyed the king's congratulations and his request that Nefertari present herself at court to describe her journey and to offer some of her exotic goods as tribute to the royal house. The audience with the pharaoh was both an honor and a test. For while Amenemhat III was known to be an enlightened ruler who valued competence and achievement regardless of the individual's social position, he was also deeply traditional in many respects, and surrounded by advisors who might view a woman's commercial success as threatening to established hierarchies, and Nefertari prepared carefully for this meeting, consulting with friends who had court experience about proper protocol, selecting gifts that would impress without appearing excessive or presumptuous, and rehearsing her presentation to ensure that she conveyed confidence without arrogance, competence without threatening the expertise of the pharaoh's own officials, and appropriate feminine modesty, while still claiming credit for her achievements. The actual audience took place in one of the pharaoh's private reception halls rather than the great throne room, suggesting that Amenemhat wanted a more intimate conversation than a formal state occasion. And Nefertari found herself facing a man who was perhaps 50 years old, his face showing the intelligence and calculation that had allowed him to navigate the dangerous waters of royal politics for 27 years. And he listened with apparent genuine interest as she described the journey to Punt, asking penetrating questions about navigation methods, about the political situation in the southern lands, about trade goods and market conditions, and about her assessment of whether regular trade with Punt could be established or whether this had been a unique, opportunistic voyage. And Nefertari answered honestly, neither exaggerating her accomplishments nor minimizing the difficulties and risks, and she sensed that this straightforward approach pleased the pharaoh, who was undoubtedly accustomed to being told what people thought he wanted to hear, rather than unvarnished truth. At the conclusion of the audience, Amenemhat made a pronouncement that simultaneously validated Nefertari's achievements and created new challenges for her future. He declared that her success had brought honor to Thebes and to Egypt, that her example demonstrated that talent and determination were not limited by gender, and that he was therefore granting her official recognition as a royal merchant, a status that would give her certain privileges, including priority access to government contracts, protection under royal authority when traveling in foreign lands, and the right to use the pharaoh's cartouche on her commercial seals. But that also carried responsibilities, including the obligation to provide detailed reports on foreign lands and peoples to the royal administration, to give the pharaoh's agents first option to purchase particularly valuable items before offering them on the open market, and to serve as an advisor to the government on matters of trade and commerce. And this mixed blessing of privileges and obligations meant that Nefertari had achieved a level of official recognition that no woman in Egyptian history had previously attained in the commercial sphere, but that she would now be operating under greater scrutiny and with less autonomy than she had previously enjoyed. The months following her return from Punt were consumed with the complex tasks of liquidating the expedition's cargo, distributing profits to investors, managing the sudden expansion of her business as new opportunities flooded in from every direction, and navigating the social and political complexities that came with her elevated status. And through all of this, she was supported by Senenmut, who had essentially become her business partner, though they maintained the fiction that he was merely her senior employee. and their relationship had evolved into something that existed in the ambiguous space between professional collaboration and romantic partnership. They had not become intimate in the physical sense, as Nefertari still felt bound by her marriage vows, even though Amenemopet's extended absences on his trading voyages meant that they spent little time together. But there was an emotional intimacy between her and Senenmut that felt more profound than the formal connection she had with her husband, and this situation created guilt and confusion that Nefertari struggled to resolve, knowing that she could not maintain this ambiguous state indefinitely, but uncertain how to move forward without betraying someone's trust or her own principles. The situation came to a head when Amenemopet returned from a year-long trading voyage to discover how dramatically his wife's status had changed in his absence, finding her not just a successful merchant but a figure of genuine importance in Thebes' commercial and political life, and his reaction was complex. He was proud of her achievements and recognized that they had made them both wealthy, but he was also clearly uncomfortable with her prominence and with the reality that she was now far more significant in the business world than he would likely ever be. And he began making comments suggesting that perhaps she should reduce her direct involvement in expeditions and focus more on the domestic role of a proper wife, perhaps use her wealth to establish their household in greater comfort, and devote her energy to raising the children they had not yet conceived. And these suggestions revealed the fundamental incompatibility between them. For while Amenemopet was a decent man and a skilled sailor, he ultimately could not fully embrace the idea of a wife who exceeded his own achievements and who commanded respect and authority that he would never enjoy. Their marriage deteriorated slowly rather than explosively, not through dramatic conflicts, but through the gradual accumulation of small tensions and unspoken resentments. And Nefertari found herself dreading Amenemopet's returns from his voyages rather than welcoming them, and she recognized that they had made a mistake in marrying, having been drawn together by practical compatibility and mutual respect rather than by the deeper connection that a lasting partnership required. And when Amenemopet announced that he was planning an extended expedition that would keep him away for at least 2 years, possibly longer, traveling to the far western Mediterranean and perhaps even beyond the Pillars of Hercules, to the mysterious Atlantic Ocean, there was relief on both sides, an unspoken acknowledgement that time apart might allow them both to gain perspective on what they wanted from life and whether their marriage could continue in any meaningful sense. With Amenemopet departed, and with her business established on firm foundations that allowed her to delegate many routine operations to trusted employees, Nefertari found herself with time to pursue interests beyond pure commerce, and she began to involve herself in broader civic activities, serving as a patron to young women who showed potential for business or scholarship, supporting the expansion of Thebes' harbor facilities which benefited all merchants, and perhaps most significantly, establishing what would later be recognized as one of the first systematic approaches to commercial education, where promising young people, regardless of gender, could learn the skills of reading, writing, mathematics, navigation, and negotiation that were essential for success in trade. And this educational initiative was revolutionary because it challenged the assumption that such knowledge should be restricted to those from merchant families or those who could afford private tutors. And it created opportunities for talented individuals from modest backgrounds to rise based on merit rather than birth. And among the early students in this program were several young women who would go on to establish their own trading operations in later years, creating a small but growing community of female merchants who looked to Nefertari as their founder and inspiration. But success continued to breed opposition, and Patashepses, who had been conducting his covert campaign against Nefertari for years now, escalated his efforts, recognizing that if he did not act decisively, she would soon be so well established that challenging her would be impossible, and he began to spread a new set of rumors, more specific and more damaging than his previous vague insinuations, claiming that Nefertari had obtained her royal merchant status through bribery and sexual favors to court officials, that her trade goods were frequently smuggled contraband that avoided proper taxation, that she maintained an intimate relationship with Senenmut, who was technically her employee, creating a scandal that violated both moral and legal standards, and most dangerous of all, that she had exceeded her authority during the Punt expedition by conducting diplomatic negotiations that were properly the prerogative of royal officials, effectively usurping governmental functions and potentially creating foreign policy complications that could damage Egypt's interests. These accusations were serious enough that they could not be ignored, and the Merchant Council conducted a formal investigation, examining Nefertari's business records, interviewing members of her expeditions, and consulting with government officials about the diplomatic aspects of her activities. And the investigation was a grueling ordeal that lasted 3 months, during which Nefertari's business suffered, as uncertainty caused partners and customers to hesitate in their dealings with her, and she endured the humiliation of having to defend herself against baseless charges, while knowing that even if she was ultimately exonerated, the stain on her reputation might never fully fade. And she faced the very real possibility that everything she had built could be destroyed, not through any failure of her own, but through the malicious efforts of a man who could not tolerate her success. The investigation ultimately vindicated Nefertari on all significant charges. The examiners found her business records to be meticulous and entirely legal. The accusations of bribery and sexual misconduct were found to be completely unsubstantiated, and while there were some questions about the diplomatic aspects of her activities in Punt, the officials concluded that she had acted within reasonable bounds and had actually provided valuable intelligence about foreign conditions that benefited Egypt's strategic interests. But the investigation also revealed something unexpected, for in tracing the source of the accusations, the investigators discovered that Patashepses himself had been engaged in the very sort of illegal activities that he had accused Nefertari of committing, including smuggling goods without proper taxation, bribing harbor officials to falsify cargo manifests, and maintaining a network of informants in rival merchant houses who provided him with confidential information that he used to undercut their negotiations. And when this evidence was presented to the Merchant Council, they had no choice but to expel Patashepses from their organization and refer the matter to royal authorities for potential criminal prosecution. And this dramatic reversal transformed Nefertari's situation from one of desperate defense to one of triumphant vindication, and it discredited the faction that had opposed women's involvement in trade, making their arguments appear to be based not on principled concerns, but on self-interested attempts to eliminate competition. Of this ordeal, Nefertari reassessed her priorities and made several decisions that would shape the final phase of her career. She concluded that while commercial success was satisfying, it was not ultimately the most important or most enduring contribution she could make to Egyptian society, and she began to transition from being primarily a merchant to being primarily an educator, mentor, and advocate for expanding economic opportunities for women and for people from non-elite backgrounds. And she used her considerable wealth to establish permanent institutions, including a trading house that was structured as a cooperative where multiple merchants could pool resources and share risks, a school dedicated to commercial education that would continue operating long after her death, and perhaps most radically, a legal fund that would provide representation for women involved in business disputes, ensuring that they would not be disadvantaged by lack of resources when facing wealthier male opponents. And these institutions became her true legacy, more enduring than any specific trading voyage or commercial triumph. Her relationship with Senenmut also evolved during this period, and when news reached Thebes that Amenemopet had been killed in a storm off the coast of Iberia, she found herself widowed and free to make her own choices about her personal life without the constraints of an existing marriage. And she and Senenmut finally acknowledged what had been obvious to everyone else for years, that they loved each other with an intensity and depth that transcended mere attraction or companionship, and they married in a quiet ceremony that was witnessed by close friends, and that marked the beginning of a partnership that would last for the remainder of their lives. And together they continued to push the boundaries of what was considered possible, organizing expeditions to places that had never seen Egyptian traders, establishing commercial relationships that brought wealth to Thebes and expanded knowledge of the world beyond Egypt's traditional sphere, and creating a household that was renowned not just for its commercial success, but for its hospitality, its support of scholarship and the arts, and its commitment to justice and opportunity for those whom traditional society overlooked. In the final years of her active career before she gradually withdrew from daily operations to focus on teaching and mentoring, Nefertari organized one last great expedition, a journey that would combine everything she had learned during decades of trading ventures. And the destination was the mysterious land of Dilmun, an island civilization in the Persian Gulf that controlled the sea routes between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, and that was said to be a paradise on earth, where sickness and death did not exist, and where trees produced fruits of such sweetness that those who tasted them forgot all sorrows. And while Nefertari was too practical to believe these mythological claims, she recognized that Dilmun was a crucial trading nexus that offered access to goods from the Far East, including precious stones, exotic woods, and spices that commanded premium prices in Egyptian markets. And she assembled an expedition of unprecedented scale with 6 ships, more than 200 people, and trade goods valued at more than a king's ransom. And she invited promising students from her commercial school to join the expedition as a learning opportunity. And she brought along scribes and artists to document everything they encountered, creating a record that could be studied by future generations. The journey to Dilmun required more than a year of traveling, sailing down the Red Sea and then along the Arabian coast through waters that were poorly mapped and frequently dangerous. And they encountered countless adventures, including peaceful exchanges with Bedouin tribes, narrow escape, TS from pirates operating out of hidden coves, visits to ancient ports whose histories stretched back thousands of years. And eventually they reached Dilmun itself, which proved to be not a mythical paradise, but a thriving commercial center where merchants from a dozen different cultures congregated to exchange goods and information. And Nefertari found herself negotiating with Sumerian traders from Mesopotamia whose cuneiform writing system was utterly different from Egyptian hieroglyphics, with dark-skinned merchants from the Indus Valley whose language she could not speak, but with whom she could communicate through the universal language of commerce and gesture, and with local Dilmun merchants who had developed sophisticated financial instruments, including primitive forms of credit and insurance that were more advanced than anything used in Egypt. And she absorbed all of this knowledge, understanding that successful trade was not just about moving physical goods, but about understanding how different societies organized their economies and finding ways to bridge between different systems. The return from Dilmun brought Nefertari back to Thebes as an old woman, her hair now white, her face lined with the marks of countless days under harsh suns, and her body bearing the scars and aches of a lifetime of physical hardship. But her mind was as sharp as ever, and her determination to share what she had learned was undiminished, and she spent her final years teaching at the school she had established, writing down her experiences in texts that would be copied and preserved in temple libraries, and mentoring the next generation of traders who would carry Egyptian commerce to even more distant markets. And she had the satisfaction of seeing that the world she had fought so hard to change was indeed changing, that women's participation in commerce, while still uncommon, was no longer considered impossible, that talent and determination were increasingly recognized as more important than gender or birth in determining who could succeed, and that the boundaries of the known world were constantly expanding as each generation of traders and explorers pushed beyond the limits that their predecessors had accepted. When Nefertari finally died at the age of 68, worn out from a lifetime of extraordinary exertion but satisfied with what she had accomplished, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including merchants and sailors and students whose lives she had touched, and including a representative of the pharaoh who read a royal decree posthumously honoring her as one of the greatest merchants in Egyptian history and ordering that her texts be preserved in the royal archives. And her tomb in the Valley of the Nobles was decorated with scenes not of the usual religious imagery, but of her various expeditions, showing caravans crossing deserts, ships sailing distant seas, and Nefertari herself standing tall and proud, leading her people through dangers to achievement. And beneath these images were inscribed the words that she had chosen as her epitaph, a simple statement that captured the essence of her life's philosophy and that would inspire countless others who would come after her, facing their own challenges and seeking their own paths to achievement despite the obstacles that society placed before them. And the words read, "I did not accept the limitations that others tried to impose upon me. I did not believe those who said that women could not lead or that the distant places were unreachable. I trusted in my own judgment and in the support of those who believed in justice and possibility, and I discovered that the boundaries we think are real are often just illusions that dissolve when we have the courage to challenge them. And this message resonated across the sea. Entries, speaking not just to the specific context of ancient Egyptian society, but to the universal human struggle between those who seek to maintain existing hierarchies and those who dare to imagine and create more expansive possibilities. And while Nefertari's specific achievements were eventually forgotten by all but scholars who studied ancient commercial history, her example lived on in the gradual expansion of opportunities that each generation created for the next, and in the persistent human conviction that talent and determination should matter more than the arbitrary categories into which society sorts people, and, in the end, perhaps this was the true treasure that Nefertari had brought back from her desert crossings and sea voyages, not the frankincense and myrrh and precious stones that had enriched her and her investors, but the proof that the human spirit could overcome even the most entrenched obstacles when it was properly directed with courage, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to achieving goals that others considered impossible.